Today we're speaking about emotional control because there is a pain nobody likes to talk about. And I'm not talking about the pain of failure or the sting of rejection. It's actually the pain of watching yourself respond to life in a way that contradicts completely who you've become. Because if you're watching this, there's a good chance you've already reached a considerably high level. You've got the career, the lifestyle, and the ambition to do or continue to do great things. You can probably even take a great deal of pressure without losing sleep, and by most measures, you are a very capable man. But then, once a woman comes into the picture, there's an underlying anxiety you can't seem to shake, or maybe an irritability that bleeds into everything you do. And this is exactly the conflict most high achieving men tend to carry. It's the gap between who you are in the real world and who you've become when there's romantic emotions involved in your personal life. But this alone doesn't define your identity or prove you're weak, because it's actually the direct result of a skill you were never taught. Most people think of emotions like labels, like happy, angry, anxious, jealous. But the truth is, emotions are like states made up of three measurable axes: your level of alertness, so how activated or calm your nervous system really is. Secondly, your valence, whether what you're experiencing registers as good or bad. And thirdly, your attention bias, whether your focus is directed inward toward what you're feeling or outwards towards what's happening around you. And that third axis is actually everything. A man who is reactive is a man whose internal world is completely dictated by external events. If she goes cold, his internal world collapses. If she cancels plans, his alertness spikes and his valence drops. And his attention is entirely consumed by external events. The outside world is controlling his inside world, and he has no framework or structure to influence it. Research has consistently shown that emotional regulation, the ability to manage and respond to your emotional states, is one of the strongest predictors for romantic success, leadership ability, and long term mental health. But weirdly enough, most men were handed no tools for developing this superior ability. You were taught to suppress, push through, or downgrade your tougher experiences. But what you weren't taught is that suppression and regulation are actually different things. Because while one buries the emotion, the other actually helps you process it. And as you may very well know, what is shoved down has a habit of coming to the surface in uglier forms at the worst possible moment. Emotions are not random. They are like critical signals your brain uses for making decisions. There are documented cases of people who had the emotional centers of their brain completely removed, and the expectation was that without emotion clouding their judgment, they would be able to make better decisions. But actually, the opposite happened. They became totally paralyzed because without an emotional signal, the rational mind just drowns in information, and your emotions themselves are not a threat. The problem is that the model of reality out of which they arise often don't align with actual reality. And even when those emotions are justified, they are going to change. What feels reasonable one moment is out of pocket in another moment. But what doesn't change, however, are the consequences of your own actions. So, what I'm going to share with you is a framework I call emotional architecture. And this framework doesn't necessarily ask you to numb yourself or be performative in any kind of way. It simply builds the structure beneath your emotions so that when they are tested, you can actually respond with composure. The goal here is to build emotional resilience without becoming insensitive or callous in the whole process. Because the man who comes out of this doesn't just have better relationships, he also carries himself with intention and calmness in a way that everyone feels deep down. Alright, so the first thing we're going to cover is why the strongest men actually crack under emotional pressure. Because before you can build anything, you need to understand what emotions actually are and where they come from. Emotions exist at their core for two reasons: to help you form bonds and to help you predict the world around you. That's it. That's what they're for. You are not born understanding hunger, cold, or discomfort. As a child, every internal need registered as a single, undifferentiated signal, like anxiety, for example. Whenever you cried, the caregiver just responded, and over time, that loop from internal state to external response to ultimately relief became the foundation of your entire emotional system. So your brain learned to predict what the outside world would do based on your internal state, such as whether external things were reliable and whether certain bonds could be ultimately trusted, right? And that wiring simply gets more sophisticated as you get older. It never goes away, which means that the man who completely falls apart when she goes cold isn't reacting irrationally. He's running a very old piece of software that was written before he had any say in it. The software wasn't built for logic, it was built for survival and connection. And it is running in the background of every single one of these relationships. And most men never actually become aware of it. And instead, what they do is alternate between two broken extremes. The first extreme is emotional amputation. This is the man who has successfully divorced himself from feeling. He is numb, he's controlled, and he's unreadable. And he somehow mistakes this for some kind of superiority. But the psychological cost of this is actually enormous. The only emotion that reliably survives amputation is anger, which is punctuated by long stretches of colorless objectivity. So he is simply disconnected from reality and experiencing life in kind of black and white. The second extreme is emotional fusion. This is the man with no space between the feeling and his identity. He is completely identified with his emotion. So when he's anxious, he becomes the identity of anxiety. When he's hurt, he becomes the identity of hurt. He assumes whatever he feels is justified and he acts on it immediately. Every shift in her mood, for example, completely destabilizes him, and every piece of friction is almost like a crisis. In reality, a lot of men who believe they're stoic are actually oscillating between these two extremes depending on the day. The mistakes at the core of both is confusing stoicism on the one hand with shutdown on another. Take Marcus Aurelius, for example. He wasn't a man who was numb and felt nothing. He actually was a man who felt everything in its totality, but had built internal architecture to process it without being controlled by it. That distinction is really important because the correct model is something closer to swimming. You are in the water, you feel the current, but you are not identified fully with the water. You are not drowning in it, and you haven't refused to get in either. You are moving through it with skill and experience. When you are emotionally activated, your attentional bias shifts towards interoception. You are no longer tracking the outside world accurately. You are consumed by your internal state and the story your brain is generating about what her silence may mean. So you are responding to the internal weather it created, not to what's actually happening. You see? So the man who has built emotional regulation has learned to deliberately manage that balance. He can feel the internal shift, diagnose it, and choose how much of his attention to give it before deciding how to respond. And this is actually a skill set beyond suppression, beyond numbing, or beyond just having pent up trauma. So here's the scenario you've probably lived. You are probably the kind of man who makes difficult decisions at work, probably without blinking, right? You manage teams, deadlines, conflicts, high stakes outcomes. You are calm, clear, and probably very effective under professional pressure too. Then you get home and your girlfriend is distant or something seems off, and within an hour, the composure and high performance you carried all day seems to suddenly die away, and you're either withdrawing, overthinking, or picking a fight about something completely unrelated to what's actually bothering you. This is the same man with two completely different responses to pressure, and it's the predictable result of trained competence in one domain and zero training in another. But here's the thing, women are not testing you to be cruel. The emotional shifts or sudden distance are not just arbitrary, they are at a deep level a subconscious assessment. So a woman who is considering building something real with you needs to know whether your composure is structural or just cosmetic, whether you are actually grounded or whether you've just been lucky enough not to be tested yet. And when you fail that test, she doesn't just consciously put a reminder, she feels it in her body as a lack of safety. And lack of safety is one of the fastest ways to destroy respect. Think in jiu-jitsu. The moment you show frustration, your opponent levels up almost immediately because they have data on what to keep doing that is working. The same is true in every high-stakes relationship. Every time you show your emotional cards, you hand the other person a map to your insecurities, and women, consciously or not, will make use of it. Effectiveness comes from remaining calm during conflict without needing to maliciously manipulate people. The moment a man stops reacting to every shift in her emotional weather and starts responding from clarity, the dynamic reorganizes around his frame of reality. She doesn't pull back further because for the first time she's actually encountered something she can't even easily unsettle. This is what emotional architecture actually produces. It's not a man who feels less, but someone who responds better. So here's the 6-month emotional architecture framework. But before we dive in, here's the problem with most advice on emotional control. It is focused entirely on what to do in the moment, like breathing deeply, counting to 10, or taking a walk. And while those things may have their place in specific situations, they are more like crisis management than construction. You cannot build a house during a storm. You must build it before the storm arrives so that when it does come, you have actually a solid foundation. And emotional architecture is a compounding process. The inputs are small and the daily effort is manageable. But at the 6-month mark, the man on the other side of his work is genuinely unrecognizable because he built something brick by brick that can't be taken away from him. This is a man's superpower. So here's the blueprint. The first step you have to get right is learning to read your own state. You should take note of that because you cannot regulate what you haven't mapped. Most men have a vague awareness that certain things set them off. She goes cold and something stirs. She cancels plans and there's a feeling you can't quite place, right? But a vague awareness is not a map. And without a map, you are always reacting blindly. In any moment of emotional activation, you have to ask yourself these 3 questions. How alert am I right now? Where am I on the scale between calm and activated? Secondly, is what I'm feeling registering as good or bad? And is that accurate to what's actually happening? Or is it just a story I'm telling myself? Thirdly, where is my attention? Am I tracking the actual situation in front of me, or am I completely consumed by what's going on inside? Now, these aren't meant to be therapy questions, very important. They are more like diagnostics, because behind every emotion is a thought. And thoughts are not facts, they are interpretations, often very inaccurate ones, by the way. So when you name what you're feeling and locate where your attention has gone, you can break the automatic connection between your stimulus and your response. Think of it like debugging code. You cannot fix an error you haven't even located. Most men spend years treating the symptoms like anger, withdrawal, or neediness without ever tracing them back to their source. So you have to name it first, and everything else follows from that. The second step is building a physical anchor practice. The body leads the mind and not the other way around. This is not meant to be a metaphor, by the way. When you are emotionally activated, your nervous system is running the show. Your prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for rational thought and measured response, goes completely offline. You are physiologically in a state of high alertness and very low self-control. You cannot think your way out of that because you are inside it, and not vice versa. The vagus nerve, the primary communication line between your brain and your body, is central to this, and actually, contrary to popular belief, vagus activation is not simply about calming down. It is also about shifting your level of alertness. And that shift is the fastest route back to a state where regulation is even possible. So think, cold exposure, for example, intense physical training, breath work, meditation. These are all tools for training your nervous system to return to baseline faster under pressure. Self-deprivation sends a direct signal to the animal part of your brain that you are in charge. And the mammalian brain runs the show if you don't consistently demonstrate through action that you are the one setting the terms. Discipline is simply the ability to prioritize the needs of your future self over your present self. And the body is where that lesson gets taught first. So build a daily physical practice that introduces controlled stress and watch how your threshold for emotional activation rises across the next few months. Step 3 is developing response delays. You may have heard of this before, but the gap between stimulus and response is where your power really lives. Viktor Frankl wrote about this inside a concentration camp. He observed that the one freedom no external force could take from him was the freedom to choose his response. It's not to eliminate the stimulus or to pretend it didn't affect him. It's more to insert a deliberate pause between what happened on the one hand and what he did next on the other. That pause is a muscle that is weak at first but gets stronger with deliberate use. The practical point, though, is to start small. So when you're triggered or tense, don't give in to the temptation to respond. You must give yourself time to regain clarity rather than provide an immediate reaction. Because when an argument starts to escalate, you have to physically remove yourself from the situation momentarily before continuing. Unless, of course, you want to make a whole disaster of the whole thing. And the thing is, stifling small emotions is not suppression either. A minor irritation or a flash of jealousy are actually spontaneous responses and will fade away if you don't feed them. You don't need to process every small change. You need to not act on it. And over time, consistently not acting on small emotional noise makes self-control purely automatic. The man who can delay his response always has a degree of freedom, and the man who reacts immediately is always at the mercy of his own feelings. Step 4. Auditing your inputs. Whether you are aware of it or not, what you consume daily is shaping your emotional baseline, and most men have no idea how poisoned that baseline has become. Your emotional state at any given moment is not just a product of what happened today, it's a product of your nervous system's running average. So it's the collected input of your sleep, nutrition, content diet, social environment, and the sources you've allowed to give you good or bad feelings about yourself. A man who is sleep deprived, poorly nourished, and chronically overstimulated is starting every day with a disadvantage because his alertness is already out of control before anything has even happened. He is fighting with a handicap he actually imposed on himself. But inputs go beyond the body, you see? Your tribe shapes your baseline too. Even 45 seconds of scrolling through someone's content. Your brain absorbs and begins to mimic what it's repeatedly exposed to. So the same door that is open to positive influence is also open to negative influence. So please be selective about who and what gets access to that. Map where your dopamine is really going. You only have a finite amount to spend. If most of it is going to passive consumption, you are literally training your brain to be a passenger. You have to reassign it deliberately towards challenge, creation, purpose, and the vision of the man you're building in the mirror. Examine what goes in, the content, the substances, the sleep, the food, the people. Clean these inputs and your baseline will improve instantly. Fifth is set boundaries from values and not emotions. You see, most men always set boundaries in the wrong way because they set them in the heat of the moment, from frustration or from hurt, which means they land as ultimatums. And ultimatums built on emotion collapse the moment the emotions sink. She pushes back, the tension rises, and before you know it, the boundaries you set last Tuesday feel embarrassing to reinforce. So then you don't, and then she learns that your boundaries aren't even real or reliable. They are flexible and able to be bent to her will. A boundary that comes from anger is an emotional reaction, while a boundary that comes from a sharp clarity is a firm standard. And standards exist before the situation arises. You know what you will and won't accept because you have thought clearly and carefully about who you are and what kind of relationship you are building. When something crosses that line, the conversation should be calm, clear, and beyond any negotiations. This is the only way for certainty to be taken seriously. It's the difference between a man who raises his voice to be listened and a man whose clarity doesn't need force or threat to be pushed. And certainty only comes from values you're actually defined clearly at the outset of the relationship, not halfway through it, or when certain feelings that you don't like happen to arise. Train in high pressure environments. Emotional regulation is a skill, and skills require resistance to be developed. It is literally psychologically impossible to get stronger without effortful repetition. You would not expect to become a strong swimmer by reading about swimming. You get into the water, you encounter resistance, you adapt. The emotional weight room works the same way, with one critical difference. You don't get to choose when you're in it. Whether it's the difficult conversation you've been avoiding or the relationship friction you'd rather not address, these are not inconveniences. They are the battleground for self-improvement. Every time you come out of the other side in one piece, you are building evidence. Evidence that you can handle pressure and that you are a man who confronts difficulty rather than deliberately avoid it. Evidence accumulated over 6 months becomes part of your identity, and you will not be perfect at this in month one. And listen, it would be weird if you were, so you're not supposed to be. In the first month, you are planting. In month 3, you are starting to notice the growth. And by month 6, other people notice it before you even say a word. One last thing worth noting very clearly is that this framework is not about suppressing genuine grief, real trauma, or significant loss. Those require processing and not just stifling. What we are talking about here is the daily noise, the minor irritations, the reactive jealousy, the ego bruises, the emotional static that most men let run their lives without ever questioning it. The man on the other side of this process doesn't just have better relationships or more self power. He has, more importantly, a better relationship with himself. And that, more than any tactic or strategy you can implement in your own life, is what makes a man genuinely attractive, respectable, and competent in any realm that he wants to dominate in. So with that said, my friends, this video has come to an end. I hope you've took some value from this. If you want more personal guidance from me directly, you can click the first link in my bio